And we're live on Facebook and everywhere else. So, dear all, good morning, good day, very warm welcome to our 7th edition of the World HandCOV'd series, but a very, very special one. This panel discussion is special for at least 3 reasons. First of all, because it deals with the United Nations, which is the international organization in the realm of international security and peace. Secondly, because we have an absolutely all-star panel today, and I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment, but that's really great honor and pleasure to be co-hosting this event with such great speakers. And finally, why is it so special? Because, as you know, the World HandCOV'd project is co-organized and co-implemented by 2 partners, which is the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Belarus office. But this particular event is co-hosted by a 3rd partner, and it is also a great pleasure and privilege to be welcoming the International Institute of Peace. It will be represented today by one of the speakers, but also by its director, Stephanie Fenkart. So Stephanie and all the colleagues, thank you very much for joining this endeavor, and I'm absolutely sure this is going to be a great discussion and a great contribution to the whole series. I have seen quite a few new names joining this discussion, so let me spend a few seconds telling you a little bit more about the project, the World HandCOV'd. As I said, this has been implemented by the Minsk Dialogue and KAS Belarus, and the idea is quite simple. We're trying to understand the longer-term implications of the pandemic on international security, and more specifically on Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security. And we are doing this by looking at what we call key pillars of international security, namely some of the key actors, actor states, which are playing a key role for international security, but also key international organizations. We've already discussed NATO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, and today we're dealing, as I said, with the organization, the United Nations. It's my greatest pleasure to present to you our speakers, our all-star cast. Let me begin with Angela Kane, who is currently Vice President of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna, but is, of course, known in the whole world as the former UN Under-Secretary General and also former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. So, Angela, thank you very much for joining us, and it's a great honor and pleasure. Our next speaker is Mona Ali Halil, who is director of MAC Law International, but is also very well known in the world as a former senior legal officer within the UN system. She's also affiliate of the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflicts. Mona, thank you very much for devoting your time. Our 3rd speaker is Olaf Wientzek, who is director of the Multilateral Dialogue Geneva office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And Olaf is one of the authors of the 2 papers we have prepared for this particular session. And you can find those papers on the Minsk Dialogue's website. And I really encourage everyone to have a look at those papers in more detail, even though they will be presented by the 2 authors. So Olaf is the first author, and the second one is Professor Aliaksandr Baicharov. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Baicharov. Besides being currently the professor at the Belarusian State University, Aliaksandr Baicharov is a former director for international security and disarmament and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, and also spent quite some years working within the UN system in New York. So once again, a very, very warm welcome to everyone. And before I hand it over to Stephanie, who is going to take care of the main moderation job, let me also say a couple of words about the interpretation function, which is available for those of you who have registered here in Zoom and those who want to listen to the discussion in Russian, because otherwise it's going to be in English. So we have this panel in the lower part of your screen, and you have the interpretation button, and it works very easily. You just need to check the Russian language, and then it's going to be in Russian. Okay, other than that, it's once again a great pleasure, and let me now hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Yauheni. Also from our side, thank you very much for the cooperation. I think it's a very important topic now, especially also in not yet post-COVID time. Let's hope that at one time we will reach the post-COVID time, but about talking about international organizations and what it means, because we know that global problems, they need to be addressed internationally, and this refers to most security challenges, be it climate change, international terrorism, migration, organized crime, cyber criminality, wars, conflicts, but also, of course, the pandemic, as we see right now. For the procedure, I would just also like to ask everyone, if you have questions, you can already post them while we are still speaking. We are going to start speaking within, the experts are going to start first, but of course we hope to have a vivid discussion afterwards, so feel free to post any questions, take the opportunity with all the experts here to discuss what the United Nations can do, what the United Nations should be doing probably also. I would like now to start first with Mr. Olaf Wientzek. He was already mentioned, director of the Multilateral Dialogue Geneva office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And my question would be if you could elaborate a little bit also on the paper you have been submitting before about the whole situation. What does the pandemic show for multilateralism? What is the role of China? What is the role of the US? What is the role of international organizations? Around 5 to 6, 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Oh, thanks a lot, first of all, and thanks to those who organized this and for the invitation, of course. This is quite a challenge to answer all these questions in 5, 6 minutes, but I'll try to be very general and outline a bit kind of the main hypotheses of the paper. Of course, and this is a very important preliminary remark, as you rightly mentioned, we are still probably at the beginning of the crisis. It's something that the Director General of the WHO regularly says, and even though the numbers in many parts of Europe may be going down or stabilizing themselves as a somewhat lower level, the pandemic is far from over. We see numbers, very worrying numbers in other parts of the world. We had last week's also, I would say, each new day, a new record of new infections. So I think this is very important not to adopt a Eurocentric or Western European-centric approach on that regard. Meaning also that whatever I say here may have a very limited life expectancy. So I think this is something which should always be kept in mind. I remember when we started discussing the issue of the impact of COVID in March, April, you had many Cassandras, you had many prophets which basically said, "Oh, this will be the doom for the Western model of democracy, and this is basically the new justification for authoritarianism." Well, we have seen since then that actually quite many autocratic regimes have not been doing particularly well handling the crisis. So I think one should be very careful to make too quick conclusions. That being said, I have the impression that the pandemic actually serves as a kind of accelerator of some of already existing tendencies, or laying bare certain tendencies we have been seeing for quite a while if we look at multilateralism. One thing is, and this is for me an important point, and it may be very much through a Geneva perspective, I admit, so it may be slightly more rosy than the New York perspective, is that multilateral organizations do matter. I mean, I can certainly say this for the WHO. The WHO has played a crucial role in advising member states, in warning, in issuing recommendation, in coordinating research, in pooling resources, in operational aid. This may be not important for Germany or France, but for many countries in the world, it has been absolutely crucial. Yes, the WHO has made mistakes, absolutely. Yes, it's still kind of exploring some issue of some parts of the pandemic, but it has played a vital role, and it shows that it's crucial in the context of a global pandemic to have a global organization which deals with these challenges. I would also confirm that for some other organizations, although nobody or people usually do not refer to that too much, but the WTO has also played an important role in order to create more transparency against hidden protectionist measures, which were a big problem. Because yes, for health reasons or health security reasons, you can introduce trade restrictions, but you have to notify them. You have to be transparent about them, and they need to be temporary. And the WTO has played an important role in uncovering a lot of hidden measures and thereby trying to slow down this spiral of protectionism, which we have seen in the past months. So also regarding Belarus, I think it is actually, and it remains, despite all the crises that the WTO has, it remains crucial and it remains of key importance that Belarus joins the WTO, because even the WTO played an important role. However, what we have also seen in this context is that the mandate of these multilateral organizations is often too limited to actually fulfill their functions and to actually deliver as they could or should deliver. They're extremely dependent on the goodwill of member states. We have seen this for the WHO, but we see it also for the WTO. They have troubles in the context of an increasingly geopolitical, let's say, geopolitically difficult context, to play their role, to get through their messages. We have also seen that on many issues they could not act as far as they should have done, or it would have been desired, let's say, because their mandate is just limited. So this is something which we should all take into account. Also, financially speaking, very much depending, of course, on the member states. And this is something which also, so the crisis has also shown the limits of these multilateral organizations, and some of them, one can argue, have operated sometimes rather as glorified think tanks than as real international organizations. I'm being a bit harsh here, but sometimes you have a lot of appeals, you have a lot of we urge, we welcome, and so on, but little possibility to really make a difference. But I'm not so certain that will change fundamentally so quickly. Now, the second tendency, I think, which is very important one, is that we show that China uses, of course, multilateral foreign organizations also as a very important instrument in global politics to increase its role, but also to depict itself, which is quite an irony, given the fact that we know where the virus initially appeared first, and that we know that in the first weeks China has not been communicating well towards the WHO, and we lost very important weeks in the handling of the crisis. That still China tries to present itself as a benefactor, as let's say a goodwill ambassador, if you like, on the global level. The appearance of Xi Jinping at the World Health Assembly 1.5 months ago was a very crucial example for that, where he basically presented himself as the first head of state who was speaking, that China would do, of course, a lot to cooperate, to be constructive and everything, not mentioning, of course, in any way the mistakes that have been made. This has been, of course, helped by the fact that the US has not been doing particularly well in this crisis, and lost somewhat its soft power credibility. I would not say that all of its criticism of the WHO has been completely exaggerated, but some of it certainly has been. And let's say the fierce attack that the US has provided against the WHO has only led to the fact that it kind of not many countries wanted to go as far with this criticism as the US. And Trump was invited to take the floor at the World Health Assembly, but he didn't. So who was the first one to speak? His Chinese counterpart, which made, of course, China more visible. I think still that even though the soft power credibility of the US has somewhat suffered during this crisis, I would say the West is not done yet, despite of all the calls we have heard in the first months, because actually many initiatives to combat the crisis have come actually from the global West, if you wish. So from the EU, from Germany, from France. Germany has 2 weeks ago announced, or let's say the Minister of Health of Germany has announced, to fund the WHO with 500 million euros. This is a very substantial sum in WHO terms, and helps the WHO a lot. We have seen there are very example of this, where countries like Canada, also like Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, for example, have actually put forward initiatives to maintain food supply chains, to combat protectionism. So let's say many important initiatives came from the West. So the West is not done yet. But we see, of course, that in the discourse and in these multilateral organizations, and again, this is a tendency we haven't been seeing since COVID, but also way before. But COVID makes it more visible that, let's say, the West is also under increased pressure, and that other actors try to compete. I would still say, despite of all the evolution, and this is my last point, the balance of power has not yet, I would say, changed completely. And it's something this is very important because, of course, I have my Geneva perspective. But if we look, so all these soft power topics are, of course, very important. But in hard power realities, the US is, of course, still unparalleled in many senses. And I would say this is an important actor. I would still say that, of course, and this goes for anyone, the question of sustaining military campaigns or this might be more costly because, of course, we will see the economic downturn of all this. But still, in the transatlantic partnership, we will still see that all the claims that the EU wants to become strategically autonomous, wants to become more important actor, we'll see how far that goes if defense budgets may be cut because of the budget crisis we might have at some point. We have to see about that. It is also possible that actually the first ones who come up with the vaccine will be the US. It's not a guarantee, of course, but it can well be. So despite of all this waning soft power, which I've said, they have still very impressive, let's say, research capabilities. Therefore, one should be a bit cautious to say, well, COVID will turn things upside down. But I think, and that we see that COVID may contribute to the acceleration of certain tendencies. But of course, the jury is still out to the extent that we have still to wait, of course, for the economic impact of all this. Which we will feel, I think, only in the second semester and by next year. And this is also, when we talk about the impact of COVID, it's not only the health impact, it's also the societal impact, the stability impact, and the economic impact we have to take into account. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wientzek. You mentioned many important things, especially also about the WHO and the WTO and the problems they have with their mandate. I think this is always a big problem. We are going then to discuss it more when we come more than to the United Nations, and we see the same problem there, I would say. Now I would like to go to Professor Aliaksandr Baicharov. Maybe a little bit on what Mr. Wientzek has been saying. Maybe you can follow up a little bit on it. It's of course also, you are free also to discuss or to react to what he was saying. But maybe also what you think about the United Nations nowadays in combating contagious diseases. I mean, it's not the first contagious disease we are experiencing right now. We had the HIV/AIDS before, we had SARS, etc. What is your stance on this? The floor is yours. I think okay. I think he. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Let's before we go into contemporary stage, what is you or not doing with relation to COVID-19, we should take a look what was United Nations shape when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. So its shape was not very good. United Nations Security Council, which was supposed to be reformed, was not reformed during decades now, and many countries who think they deserve to be on the Security Council permanent members list are not there. Japan, Germany, Nigeria, South Africa, India, Brazil. For many years, they were trying to get into the Security Council, make it more representative body, but they're not there. And by the beginning of the 21st century, as you know, the old Cold War confrontation.
Now you froze. let's maybe wait. Okay, maybe until he comes back, I would suggest that we go on maybe with Mona. Oh no, he's back. You're back. Excuse me. You need to re-say what you have been saying because you froze just for the last 30 seconds. Alexander.
The last, let's say, old Cold War confrontation returned back to the UN Security Council, and that's why the Security Council was not able to take necessary decisions in the crisis in Syria, Ukraine.
Alexander, you froze again. Maybe you try to restart the Zoom and we go on in the meantime with Mona. I would suggest, very sorry, but it doesn't seem to be coming. Okay, you froze again. Okay, let's try again. And otherwise, I would kindly ask you to just restart the Zoom, maybe if you freeze again. So one more time, please go ahead.
So one of the main consequences of COVID-19 in the is the securitization of medicine.
Okay. Mona, I would say it just doesn't make sense. Maybe you can start. And he was already mentioning a little bit about the Security Council as being not really representative. You know, the P5 members. I mean, there are also the elected 10 members. But maybe you can just follow up a little bit on the issue of the Security Council. I mean, what can it provide? What can it actually be doing? And yes.
I don't think restarting Zoom is going to solve the issue, but switching off the camera might do the trick because it's just it's not a stable connection, and that might help.
Okay. Still, Mona, I would say you go ahead, and then we go back to Alexander.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and it's an honor to join this distinguished panel, especially to be side by side with the likes of Ms. Angela Kane, and an honor to be affiliated with your three organizations. Let me a few comments first on Olaf's wonderful paper. I couldn't agree more with his primary premise that the COVID-19 pandemic has in many ways worked as an accelerator. And that's a perfect description of exposing the various tendencies in the international politics and the multilateral world. This is the same acceleration that we've seen at the national level in many countries, whether it's exposing the myth of American exceptionalism or the greed and corruption of Lebanon's ruling elite, all on full display for the entire world to reconsider old assumptions and prevailing myths about the ability of certain countries to succeed and others that are predicted to fail. Lebanon, despite its impending political and economic collapse, has surprised the world and had one of the better responses to COVID, along with many other developing countries and struggling countries in the world. The failure of the Security Council to take a leadership role was not surprising, but the degree of its failure may have been surprising, primarily due to the tensions between the US and China, but that failure mirrored the failure of the US administration to adopt a national strategy in its own domain and under its own jurisdiction. The inability of the Permanent Five to coalesce has paralyzed the Security Council, not for the first time, but in this particular case, leaving the UN system's primary actor in a health pandemic situation, the WHO, exposed to Chinese pressure and American attack. This was further accelerated, to borrow Olaf's word, by the existing level of erosion of the Council's credibility and the attacks by its very intended protectors on multilateralism in general. The commitment to multilateralism by several of the most important members of the Council is itself a threat to the Security Council and to the international legal and political order that we expect to be the first vanguard against these threats are themselves posing an alarming threat. Take, for example, the US pulling out of various agreements, one after the other, both at the bilateral and the multilateral level. Its apparent disregard for violations by North Korea, by India, by Israel, amongst others. China's crimes against the Uyghurs and its negation of Hong Kong's autonomous status on full display during the pandemic. Russia's actions at home and abroad, including Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. So it's difficult to look to these actors as credible leaders in this environment when their own actions are defeating of the overall goals of the United Nations and of the overall expectations of the peoples of the world. So having said that, I would like to pay tribute to Alexander's very comprehensive elaboration of the various problems confronting the UN in its recent past that pre-existed the COVID crisis, but are of course aggravated by it. He does go through the many prior situations where the Council was able to step up. As you mentioned, Stephanie, the HIV/AIDS as well as the Ebola crisis did see a Council response. They did see effective, actionable, concrete declarations and actions taken by the Security Council that we have failed to see. The General Assembly was able to step up within a matter of days and have a resolution, but the Council took more than 3 months. It's only a few days ago that the Council finally pronounced itself in a unified manner, albeit in an extremely watered down manner, primarily not to actually respond to the COVID, but to endorse the Secretary General's aspirational call for a global ceasefire. And I say aspirational intentionally because it's not likely that this will actually materialize in times of when the Council is at its most effective. It has failed to bring an end to some of these lingering conflicts. It's certainly going to be much more difficult at the nadir of its influence to be able to do so. But one thing that I would just finally end on in terms of my comments is that one thing that was missing from Mr. Biacharov's treatment of the subject is the failure to mention the US-UK aggression in Iraq, which in my view was a watershed moment for the UN and for the legal and political order. I would even go as far as saying that that aggression broke the system. And in order to fix the system, whether in order to respond to pandemics like COVID-19 and or to climate change, but to the actual classical threats that we face, many of them, including genocide currently, the UN's failure to confront that particular act and the meaning it had for the UN's credibility and relevance, both in terms of the jus ad bellum and jus in bello violations that the US and UK committed in Iraq, will, I believe, impede any effort to restore the credibility and primacy of the UN Charter. Until those implications are acknowledged and addressed, I think it will be very difficult for the UN to regain the primacy and credibility that it once enjoyed.
Thank you very much, Mona. Very interesting points. Now, Aliaksandr, I think we can try again, and maybe you can also already react a little bit on what Mona said, since she was also referring to your paper. You need to switch on your mic.
Okay, my mic is on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I'll try to continue. The UN is a mirror that reflects the main problems and contradictions of contemporary world. And the lasting confrontation between Russia and the West, between the USA and China, is undoubtedly very negatively reflected in the organization's capabilities to deal with the global threats and challenges. And in 2000, United Nations Security Council adopted
We cannot hear you. Can you hear us? I'm very sorry. I think it doesn't work. Maybe we can try again. We couldn't hear you again, Aliaksandr. It's the connection seems to be very bad, and We cannot hear you.
Okay, yeah, I understand.
Maybe we can try in 10 more minutes again, and then I would like to give the floor now to Angela. Angela,
Sure.
you have very, very long experience within the United Nations. You know the organization by heart, and you also know Mona, and you also have been listening to what has been said before. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on what was already said. And then, of course, the question in the end is if the United Nations is living up to its intended role nowadays, considering what is happening. I mean, it was just mentioned, the confrontation, Russia, West, US, China, this all blame game, and also considering that now we would actually need a spirit of cooperation, since all these issues, these security issues, can only be addressed internationally and globally. The floor is yours, Angela.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have this tripartite collaboration, and particularly because it is focused on the UN, because sometimes I think there's so much criticism being heaped on the UN that very often the good points of the UN are being forgotten. And I also want to pay tribute to the two very good papers, the excellent papers that we've had in preparation for this. Mona has already done a lot of commentary on them, but I do want to say one thing, and I find that very interesting, because the point that Aliaksandr makes about the Security Council and saying it should be enlarged. I mean, yes, there has been a long-standing debate, and I think this is a topic that has been for 20, 25, 30 years now been ongoing. But on the other hand, the point that he makes, that this would increase the responsibility of those who are represented on the council, I just wonder whether that is actually appropriate. And I give you one example that I think is very telling in this aspect. And that is that the WTO, which Olaf mentioned earlier, was of course a very good body to be implemented. And yes, it does bring a lot of transparency, shines a light on malpractices, if I can call it that, and starts to abolish them. But when China was admitted some 20 years ago to the WTO, I remember that Bill Clinton, the US president at the time, argued that this would bring China up into the level of being responsible for its action and therefore desisting from some of the practices of copyright infringements, etc., etc. And that, sadly to say, has not happened. So I'm not sure that always membership in a body brings with it a higher sense of responsibility, of sort of being true to a higher approach of doing something that is good for not only yourself, but also that brings in others. So that is my one point of contention that I have, but many of the other points I totally agree with. And what I find interesting with the pandemic, yes, we've had pandemics before, which have been handled much more proactively by the Security Council in terms of saying we need to do something about these threats, whether it's Ebola or SARS, or HIV/AIDS even. On the other hand, it's when you look at what can actually be done, very often this is exhortative, meaning, you know, we should do this and we should do this and so forth. But on the other hand, the UN has no, as we know, executive power in those issues. It relies on the cooperation and collaboration of all of the member states. And when I think, for example, the climate change, which I think Olaf mentioned already as an example of transboundary problems. When you think of climate change, when was the first climate change conference held? In 1972. That's a really long time. And yes, we have agreement, but that's being taken back now. And yes, the difficulty in the COVID issue is, or let's rather the difference is, that it is easier to assign blame. I mean, climate change blame goes to everyone. COVID, you know, there's an ability to point the finger, and that I think makes it much more confrontational and conflictive, you know, for many member states, and that's also what's prevented the agreement that could be reached in the Security Council. I'm glad Mona mentioned already the resolution that was adopted in the General Assembly, which was already way back in early March, so that was fairly quick after the pandemic was declared. And I know that they're having another meeting tomorrow, and this other meeting will basically focus on several areas, or 4 areas in particular. So it'll be much more proactive in terms of what can actually be happening. Now, when you look at the UN, I also would like to draw a comparison to other organizations. Let's look at the G7. Let's look at the G20. What have they done? They've had a meeting way back when, you know, like March, and that's it. You've never heard anything since, even though those countries have a lot more executive ability because it is small, and they're responsible as member state, as states themselves. They're responsible for their own action. And I find that very sad that there hasn't been much more of an impetus going out. And again, I think it is because of the unilateralism about the, let's say, the lack of support for multilateral action. But on the other hand, I give credit to the EU for having tried much harder to come together on these issues. But we're not there yet, and we will not be there until we actually have a vaccine. And I think that it was already mentioned before. And what are the numbers now? I think we're still in the first wave. We have 11.6 million people who are affected by COVID-19 right now. That's a huge number, and it's not going to go anywhere fast away. And yet the economic pressure of opening up the borders, of opening up the economy, of opening up schools, because this is a situation that cannot be sustained indefinitely. That is tremendously strong. And I find it very dangerous when you look at that in terms of what is going to happen, because I think the Swedish experiment, no restrictions or very few restrictions, opening up the herd instinct or herd immunity possibly, has not been very successful so far. So that is very scary. Now, of course, a global response to COVID-19 is necessary because it really is a global governance issue. And what does the Secretary General have? He has a bully pulpit. He can exhort, he can say, yes, this is what happened, whether it's the ceasefire or we should do more, we should build back better. I always never quite understand what that is all about. But let me give you specific examples which I think go unacknowledged. And that is, I've done a little bit looking at what the UN system is doing on the ground. And I'm taking the example of Belarus because it's a very important example. And we are, after all, here with the Belarusian audience and presenters as well. And the UN shipped, for example, 3.6 million pieces of personal protection equipment to Belarus. They procured $3.8 million worth of medical and protective equipment. And that is in one country only. And this also, the UN system in Belarus provides assistance to the Ministry of Health. They have a hotline for domestic violence victims that is toll-free now. And so I think that these individual actions on the ground, they never get acknowledged. They get kind of pushed under the table somehow and forgotten. And I would like to see a bit more of governments who are, and it was mentioned that it was particularly, of course, the governments that need assistance, that is acknowledged, that this is a very valid and a very important role that the United Nations is playing on the ground that gets lost in the squabble between the US and China and a number of other countries that cannot agree on resolutions or something. But this is a function that is going to be very, very hard to reciprocate on any other organization because it spans not only one organization, meaning, let's say, the UN Secretariat, but also UNICEF, UNDP, and a number of other organizations, including WHO, who are providing assistance on the ground. So let me stop here and come back to some other issues later.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think it's very important also to see, not only always to criticize, but also to see how successful in what spheres the United Nations have been successful in the last years. And I think I will later also come maybe with a follow-up question to Mona about the peacekeeping missions, for example, right now. I mean, how are they dealing in the COVID situation? I would also still like to encourage all the participants, listeners to post questions. You can also post them in Russian. I will get the translation. You see down there Q&A icon, so please feel free to ask whatever you feel like and use the opportunity to discuss with our experts. And before I will try again to give the floor to Aliaksandr, I would like to give the floor shortly to Jakob because he wanted to comment also on what Angela has just said.
No, that was Olaf who wanted to comment.
Oh, sorry, Olaf. I'm sorry. Olaf, please go along.
I admit we look very similar and we often confused in the foundation. So in any case, well, I wanted to stress exactly a couple of points Angela Kane, Mrs. Kane mentioned on the WTO, and this is in fact something which goes in general for the UN organizations. One should not overestimate the power of socialization. There is socialization going on, so yes, you enter an international organization, you adapt somewhat, at least your discourse, but sometimes, and your behavior, but sometimes you actually learn how to talk. So it's kind of a certain mimetism, but it's not necessarily profound change of behavior, and that we have seen very strongly for China in the WTO. And this is one of the reasons why the WTO is in crisis, because of course you have now countries and important countries big countries who have a very completely or quite completely different approach to economy and to the relation between the state and economy. And this is something which, of course, endangers the organization, but still, for these kind of questions, for a pandemic, for these kind of global problems, you need global platforms which leave no one behind. And this is why it's quite unfortunate, actually, that Taiwan, for example, despite of its positive examples, has not been admitted to the World Health Assembly. The second point is exactly the point on G20 and G7. I've had, before my position here in Geneva, I've worked more than 10 years on EU affairs, and it's a bit the same like with the European Council. You have the heads of state coming together, you have big statements, you have we will and we urge and everything will happen and it looks great, it looks grand, but if you don't have a secretariat, a joint secretariat, then little things will happen. I always would like to challenge someone to actually make a chronology of G7 and G20 statements or European Council statements, and each time actually after that to look of what we have promised, what have we actually implemented. And this is actually, despite of, I think I value a lot the G7 as such and the G20 as such. However, there is one big advantage the UN organizations have is they have a big secretariat. They have people who actually can follow up, where this doesn't just end up in a giant puff of smoke, but where you have people following up with implementing, because the national executives, of course, will be less willing or able to implement these kind of pledges. And the example of Belarus, I think is very telling. I think one underestimates the very concrete help, which sounds, of course, often very boring and is much more difficult often to translate. I mean, I've seen the same from the EU side. We had a couple of ministers who, when aid from China came with masks or whatever, they were kissing the Chinese flag. I didn't see anyone kissing the UN flag or the WHO flag when similar things arrived, or the EU flag, by the way. But this is unfortunately the dilemma always with international organizations, be it the EU institutions, be it multilateral organizations. It's very easy to use them as a punching ball to speak about those faceless bureaucrats who work there, because they will hardly be able to defend themselves because they do not have a population or a government, and so they're often the punching ball, and it's unfortunately underreported of the very concrete, even though sometimes little things they do.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I would say, Aliaksandr, we try it one last time. Maybe it works, and let's just fingers crossed. The floor is yours. Maybe you can also react on what was said before a little bit. I mean, I hope you have been able to follow a little bit what the other speakers have been saying, and please just add to what you have been listening to. Another try, which obviously already failed. All right, I would say before we already are getting questions in, but I would like to ask Mona still about the peacekeeping missions. I think it's a very important topic. I think there are now 13 peacekeeping operations now ongoing, but how does COVID-19, affect also the peacekeeping nations peacekeeping operations? Mona, please. Aliaksandr, your mic is turned off because you froze again, so I gave the floor already to Mona. I think it's not working. I'm very, very sorry. It's the paper is very interesting, and we can all the participants can see the paper on the Minsk Dialogue homepage, and I'm very sorry it's not working. You're freezing and we cannot hear. So Mona, please go along.
I'd like to echo Stephanie and Angela's remarks regarding the two papers. I encourage everybody to read them. They're both very short but extremely powerful and very comprehensive in the material that they cover. Briefly to respond to your question, Stephanie, with regard to the impact on peacekeeping, I'd like to step back for a moment, however, and look at the broader picture of the UN before we zoom in on the peacekeeping. And Angela's correct that we should try to focus on the positive as well as the negative in order to give a more realistic and accurate portrayal. In fact, by all accounts, the Secretary General's response to the COVID as an entity in terms of protecting the staff and protecting the ability of the various organs to function, by all accounts, the Secretariat has done an above average job of ensuring the ability of staff to continue working, not only in effective conditions, but in humane conditions. Many have remarked at how humane the response has been and how considerate it has been to people's various medical and psychological well-being, as well as the ability of the organs, making sure the technology is tested and made available so that these organs can meet. The fact that 193 members were able to meet virtually well before the 15 members of the council even met, which is insinuating a lack of commitment, not a lack of technology. But so that on that level, there was a successful UN response. The Secretary General has actually enjoyed a visibility that he did not heretofore have. Many were surprised that somebody of Mr. Guterres's abilities, his excellent communication skills, his great UN record, his great ability to grasp issues and to compellingly comment on them, nonetheless was somewhat invisible prior to this COVID response, and he has enjoyed almost a resurgence, matching more the expectations that we all had when he was elected, primarily through the aspirational appeal that many people around the world, humanity at large, find attractive, this global ceasefire call. This plays into this peacekeeping thing, in that the March 23rd call by the UN Secretary General for global ceasefire was in part to enable the peacekeeping missions to focus on COVID response and their efforts to assist governments to prepare and prevent further outbreaks. The Undersecretary General, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, echoed the Secretary General's call to enable peacekeeping missions to focus on the immediate tasks at hand, not necessarily putting aside their peacekeeping mandates, but in order to be able to deliver on the broader goals of their mandates, they had to first step in, first to protect themselves, of course, so that they, one, do not themselves become a threat or a source or a hotspot of further outbreaks in the countries they serve, but also in order to ensure the safety and well-being of the UN personnel, and therefore in a better position to assist the governments that needed their assistance. Then on March 28th that the South Koreans withdrew 200 peacekeepers from the UN mission. Now that was a natural rotation out of the South Sudan mission, UNMISS. However, what was unique about the situation is that they did not rotate a new deployment. And that this was, on the one hand, maybe a sign of things to come, that TCCs and PCCs may themselves hesitate to deploy their staff, their personnel, police and military personnel, partially because they may need them at home in order to ensure the effectiveness of their own COVID response nationally, but possibly about fears of exposing their personnel abroad. This sort of lockdown or suspension of rotations was then made official UN policy on April 7th for a limited period of time, which recently expired across all 13 missions, meaning no rotations. Now this, on the one hand, triggered or responded to fears that what happened in Haiti, for instance, with the UN bringing in cholera to the country and the tragedy that ensued, that if the UN were responsible for bringing COVID into these areas of operation, then that would be certainly against the mandate to protect, first of all. Secondly, it would expose the UN to potential liability. And third, it would defeat the purpose of them being there to assist. But what is currently being recognized is that the continued deployment, the non-rotation, also has risks, not least of which would be fatigue, would be the well-being of the personnel, their inability to fulfill their mandates, so that there are negative consequences for prolonged deployments without rotation, as well as the fact that you are averting certain other risks. So this kind of cost-benefit analysis of this policy is currently being weighed in terms of how to move forward. But overall, it's not such a bad picture. There has been a very concrete, a very coherent, articulated response, which unfortunately we have not seen from the Security Council. That vacuum, unfortunately, continues to define the organization. Many are not interested, much less aware of the Secretariat efforts and or the peacekeeping efforts. They look to the Security Council as the measuring stick of the success or failure of the United Nations at large. The travesty or the casualty of all of this is the WHO, which the critiques that are made against the WHO are valid ones, but they're also born out of the nature of the beast. The WHO cannot access the territories of its member states without the consent of those member states. And in order to obtain that consent, they will have to so-called play ball until they obtain that consent and that cooperation. So the criticisms of the WHO being too close to China on this COVID crisis are born out of the necessity of needing to have Chinese cooperation in order to be able to, first of all, deploy into the country, and second of all, have access to the sites that are needed in order to assess the various technical aspects of their mandates. And this is not unique to China. It's in any UN entity, unless it's a Chapter 7 enforcement action, which are very rare in UN history, requires the consent of the country concerned. That applies to peacekeeping missions as well as to the pandemic response. So it's easy to criticize the WHO, but we must look at it in the broader context of the fact that the member states determine how strong or how weak the UN response is by virtue of their willingness to commit to the multilateral approach.
Thank you very much, Mona. Angela said she would like to add some words on this, but I also give a question already to you, Angela, because I think you can also answer it maybe directly afterwards. The question is that if the United Nations after 89-90, could one say that it lost its role of being the most important international organization? It seems that the United Nations didn't manage to find itself a new role in the new world order. So this would be the question from the audience, but please first you can react to what Mona has been saying.
It's not so much that I wanted to react because I agree with Mona, but I just wanted to add something, which is, yes, peacekeeping, but it basically focuses on the civilian staff. You know, the UN has something like 50,000 civilian staff, you know, all over the world. And rotation is really not the object. I mean, the rotation happens by military planes, it happens for the peacekeepers. But when you look at the people who are out there in the field, and I've served in 2 peacekeeping missions, I've served in the Congo, and I've served in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And let me tell you, it is hard, you know, to be there. You're very isolated. You're away from your family. You may be stuck, not in a capital, but somewhere out in an outpost. And what happens if you get sick in a country that is not equipped for that? There will be a medical unit attached to all of the peacekeeping contingent. But on the other hand, you have no flights. You cannot reunite with your family. You cannot go anywhere. And so the psychological fatigue that Mona mentioned is there for the soldiers, but they at least have a contingent around them that is somehow of a support structure. The civilians have, yes, other colleagues as a support structure, but it is very tenuous. And I tell you that psychologically, it's extremely, extremely hard, because when we look at what happened with Ebola, and I had also a lot of contact and a lot of work there, but on the other hand, Ebola was of limited duration. With COVID, we don't know how long it's going to last. How long are you going to have to be in that situation? How long do you have to persevere? How long can you not leave your duty station? And this is something that we shouldn't forget. And again, you know, having spent most of my career in the United Nations, I'm very insistent that these things are not really happening are not really appreciated right now. They're just somehow taken for granted. Because also think about the people who are not only in peacekeeping, but in humanitarian delivery or whatever is needed to be done. So this is something that I find is regretfully very underappreciated, and yet there are a lot of sacrifices that are being paid by the people who work there, both on the peacekeeping as well as on the civilian side. And when it comes to your question, Stephanie, or the audience question about has the UN found its role, I find it extremely interesting when I look at what's happened in the aftermath of the fall of the Iron Curtain, so to say. You mentioned 89-90. In 1992, in January, that was the first ever meeting of the heads of state of the Security Council. It never happened before. And so there was this resurgence of, it's hopeful, we're all going to be really relying on multilateralism, we're all relying on the United Nations. And at the time, I think the UN itself was rather poorly equipped for taking on that role or kind of filling the shoes that it was being given. And what happened was that you had the peacekeeping missions in Somalia, you had it in former Yugoslavia, you had Srebrenica, then you had Rwanda, for example, which were major failures. And why? Because we at that time didn't even have 24-hour hotlines or connection. I mean, we basically worked on a timeline of the New York and not what was, earlier, 8 hours earlier in Africa or somewhere else. But on the other hand, I think that there has been a lot of soul searching since. And I also give a lot of credit to then Secretary General Kofi Annan, who took over in 1995 and 96. And so therefore, he had a lot of soul searching in terms of what can we do better. And that was something that I find extremely important. What have we done wrong? Where have we failed? And what can we do to change? That's what I also would like to see in terms of the COVID. And I know that a lot of the difficulties that we currently have are really because of political confrontations or disagreements and changing power roles rather than the UN itself. And I agree with Mona that the Secretary General has been very visible in terms of this crisis and has been very active in exhorting action. But on the other hand, you cannot fix something if it's only reliant on member states' willingness to cooperate or to collaborate. And you have to also give up some of the, let's say, power. And that is something that I see less and less, because I think after the 2008 economic crisis, we're still suffering from that. There's a lot more inward looking, a lot more nationalism, a lot more unilateralism. And I think the current COVID crisis, unfortunately, has really multiplied that effect. So, I think Olaf called it the accelerator, and I think I would agree with that. And that is unfortunate, because the question is, how do you move back? How do you move it back? How do you actually do that? And that is something that I think is very much in the balance right now. How do we move it back?
Thank you, Angela. We have another question, and it's from Yulia Nikitina from GIMO University from Moscow. And she asked if you think that international organizations should develop their public diplomacy capacities, for example, direct contact with the societies of the member states, in addition to what the information centers do have now. Who wants to take that one? Just raise your hand. Yes, Mona, please.
I think that the UN, the EU, more recently maybe have been rather successful in projecting a message. The problem isn't the public diplomacy; it's having something to say. The lack of concrete, coherent, comprehensive strategy, and part of that is driven by the fact that none of us really know what we're dealing with, and especially in the first few months of the COVID crisis, it was rather unprecedented. The spread, the seriousness, the lethality of the virus was still unknown. So people were scrambling, trying to find answers on a human level, on an individual level, much less at the organizational or national or international level. So that's understandable. But here we are now, 3 or 4 months later, and that lack of coherence, that lack of concreteness is still plaguing us, or no pun intended, I should say. And it's rather surprising, because the WHO has articulated a very clear strategy as to what needs to be done, whether it's about in terms of border closures, or whether it's about reporting, whether it's about contact tracing and testing, there are very real actions that can be taken and that do need international coordination and regional coordination. So the fact that, from what I understand from my European friends and at the national level, that there was a resistance almost on the part of the EU to take responsibility, to step in and guide the process, that there was this sort of retrenchment at the national level, that this should be dealt with nationally because each country has a different situation, a different circumstance. You see that in the US, where there's this kind of tendency to push up to the national level, and the administration is pushing down to the state level. So there is this kind of tug of war going on, like, where does proper responsibility lie? And the fact that it's viewed binary in a binary fashion is lethal, because it should be at both. I mean, there should be the local, there should be the state, there should be the regional, the international. While we all need to stay at home individually, we do need to come together at the national, regional, and international level in order to devise and implement a coherent strategy. And I think the answer lies in the guidance provided by WHO. By its nature, this is a health and medical crisis. Clearly it has political implications, clearly it has economic implications, but you have to respond to a health crisis with a health strategy first and foremost. And the fact that the WHO is so beleaguered we've allowed us to lose sight of the fact that they have the answers. It's not an answer that's going to be 100%, accurate. That's going to predict every consequence. That's going to capture every implication. But we need to trust the scientists. And my fear is that our inability to take such basic things at the individual level as well as at the collective level, as wearing masks and social distancing, puts really an existential fear in me about our inability to do what is necessary to deal with climate change. If we cannot take these very basic, simple, affordable, tangible measures in the immediate level to respond to this pandemic, then what hope do we have to take the much bigger sacrifices that we need to reverse the climate change crisis? And our failure to even have a consensus that there is a scientific threat to man's existence on the planet's existence is mirrored here by the fact that there are many that see this COVID as a hoax, despite the abundant evidence that it isn't, that see the response as a political machination to take over people's lives and human rights. So these are things that are really concerning, and the sooner that we can rebut, these insinuations, these conspiracy theories, and the sooner that we entrust our confidence and our commitment to the scientists, the better off we all will be.
Thank you very much. Olaf and Angela would both like to comment on that. I would say we start maybe with Olaf first, and then Angela, you can of course also comment on that one.
Yes, so first just on that question, I mean, yes, the organizations could certainly do more regarding to reach out, of course, to other societal actors, but they do actually already. The WTO has several fora, inter alia the public forum, which this year doesn't take place, unfortunately, for COVID-related reasons, but there are actually already channels. And most of all, you have, of course, also representations of some of the organizations on the ground in the respective countries, which can play a very important role. If I may say, there were a couple of questions by Marilia Hushka. Shall we take them now, or will you moderate them later, as you prefer?
I would have taken them, of course, but you can already address one. I mean, maybe the first one already. I mean, when she's asking about the pandemic that we are now have.
Can I just make one more comment before,
okay.
because it relates to Mona, and then we go to that. I mean, it's not a long comment. Yeah. What I wanted to say, and I think this is really important because also of the question of the climate change that's come up. I think that what we have seen is that because the population has expanded so much and a lot of the environment has been destroyed, we live a lot closer to wild nature. And one of the criticisms that I have is you have these live animal markets. I've lived in Asia for 2 tours of duty. I've lived in Indonesia and I've lived in Bangkok. And basically, I've seen those markets. And the large market that is in Wuhan, for example, is still not closed down. I do find that is a real danger because these zoonotic diseases that are coming from that, we've also seen that in Africa with Ebola. These don't come out from thin air. They are already present. And then basically, how do you deal with that? And that is something where I think governments do have a very strong responsibility that seems to go somehow unremarked on. And that I find very surprising because that is a danger that anytime something else, a new version of a coronavirus could actually appear again. So I just want to make that comment before we go on to another issue.
Okay, so I will moderate then the next question from Marilla Huscha, and she is asking if, she says, it seems that the global issue of the pandemic so far can only be solved by very anti-global measures such as travel restrictions, quarantine, social distancing. People will be bound more to their home countries and regional context. How do the speakers assess the power balance between the global United Nations on the one hand and regional organizations? So is the role of regional organizations going to increase vis-a-vis the United Nations? Olaf, please.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's a very good question. It's a very good point. I do not completely agree that the crisis supports only anti-global measures. Yes, there is the discussion about travel restriction, and I think the international health regulations may have to be updated on that because so far they are relatively cautious on that matter. That being said, travel restrictions are not the best, not necessarily, as we have seen, not necessarily the best way to encounter that. I mean, the US and other countries which have been quite strongly affected by the crisis have also applied travel restrictions, and still it didn't spare them from the crisis. So I think it's very dangerous to only put on, let's say, some very visible, relatively popular instruments and forgetting others which are, of course, more annoying, like the question of testing, tracing, following up contacts, and maybe more difficult to communicate. I would also argue that if you really want to combat the crisis, you cannot shut down everything, because if you shut down everything, you shut down very important supply chains for medical equipment, very important food supply chains. All this discussion, yes, we have to produce all the stuff ourselves and make gigantic silos and put it there, is very dangerous. Because what we see is that we have very strong global supply chains, which are much more efficient, actually, cost-wise, and also in some countries you simply don't have the possibility to produce and to hoard these kind of things. You have rather to protect and to globalize this kind of, to have emergency supply chains on medical equipment, maintaining food supply chains. This is absolutely crucial. If you shut that down, you will get back the crisis in a second wave, because if there are several countries in the world which will not manage at all to combat the consequences of the crisis, this will bite you in the back later on. So actually, I would say some measures are very global if you really want to combat the crisis, although it might not seem at the first glance. Now, I think, of course, regional organizations have a very big and important role to play. I mean, look at the EU now. Now, finally, the question of what role should the EU have in health does play a role, because it did not used to be an important EU competence. The question of the let's say, economic impact, this is all very much an EU matter and less maybe a UN matter. However, I think both sides have their role to play. And as we speak about the global pandemic, which does not care about borders, which does not care necessarily where one regional or when the power of one regional organization ends and the other one starts, I think that still the global organization should keep a role. And I think it's still yet out in the open whether this will be acknowledged or not. But certain regional organizations do play or have potentially a very, very important role. Very briefly, if I may, on the stepping of the US announcement to step out of the WHO. I think for this year, next year, financially speaking, the gap may be closed. As I mentioned earlier, I think the German government or the German health minister has announced 500 million of help, which is huge, which is really very important. So that may certainly help in the short term. I think other countries will pitch in. China will certainly help as well. On the long term, of course, this is more difficult. In a pandemic, it's more popular to announce big sums of money, but if you want to sustain that in the long term, this is another question. I would say also that the damage of US retreat from the WHO would also be political very strongly, and in health matters, not only financially. So I think we have, of course, to see whether we actually go through with this. This decision can be reversed, and Biden already, if he wins, has announced that he will reverse it, and the US will have to pay its financial dues because it can effectively step out.
Thank you very much. There is one last question, which I'm going to read right now. It's from Paul Revay, member of Board of Trustees from Friends of Europe, which is a think tank in Brussels. And he says, the last financial crisis showed that sovereign states are capable of coordinated action, provided that enlightened leadership is handy. Global public health has been weaponized during the COVID pandemic, but with Washington delinquency in its current G7 chairmanship and Beijing obfuscating during its March United Nations Security Council presidency, how can the United Nations gain a measure of autonomous action when populism and nationalism, this America first, going global, have weakened the domestic foundations for multilateral cooperation? Who wants to take that question? Please raise your hand. Angela, please.
The virtual background doesn't always allow a lot of hand raising, but I think that is a very good question in terms of when we look at how can the UN regain its leadership, so to say. What I fear is that a lot of it is bound up with the current US administration, and we need to see what happens in November with the elections. Will the President Trump be reelected, or will Joe Biden be elected as president of the US? The WHO decision, of course, only kicks in after a year, so a year time has now started. When it comes to other organizations, think about also the US has already withdrawn from UNESCO, for example. It has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. And I find it very interesting that, for example, when President Erdogan of Turkey announced that he wanted to transfer Hagia Sophia again into a mosque rather than as a museum, it was the Secretary of State who sort of said, oh, but you can't do that because it was designated a World Heritage Site of UNESCO. And this while UNESCO is not a member while the US is no longer a member of UNESCO. I don't have any thoughts in terms of what can be done to regain the leadership role. What I think is that the example, for example, with the economic crisis where a leadership role was very heavily played, it was a different constellation, it was a different time. What I mind about this is that in fact, the economic recession and the collapse of the banks was really a very expensive venture. A lot of money was put to it, whereas this one is an existential threat to populations and to people. The banking was not. Yes, I mean, there were jobs lost, etc. But I find that it was more of a psychological issue and a financial issue, very much so, but not really that affected people's health. So this one is much more important as far as I'm concerned in terms of where do we go as humankind, where we go as an international, not organization, but an international community. And what I also find interesting is that everyone sort of talks about the US and unilateral. But I must tell you that when you look at opinion polls that are being conducted in the United States, you find that the, quote, general people, the people who are polled in these opinion polls, have a much better opinion of the UN and also of the role that their organization, that their government is playing in it. The US really gives very little money to the UN in terms of, yes, I mean, they have their assessed budget, but when it comes to voluntary contributions or whatever it is, I mean, it dwarfs whatever also the EU is giving. The EU is giving just about the same, if not more amount. But on the other hand, the US citizens who are polled, they feel that they are doing a lot, they're paying a lot for the organization, but they also like the organization. And I think that that is something that is very poorly exploited. It's rather twisted in such a way by the whole hate speech and, the whole influencing and whatever is going on right now, this ricocheting around social media, which we didn't have in earlier years, is really a harvest that is very, very evil. And that, to my mind, I wish one could do more about. And maybe there's also something that is being looked at in terms of government action. What is actually being done about this? And here, again, I give credit to the EU. It's not perfect, but at least they're looking at this issue and they're saying, what are we actually going to do about it? So there is much more of an interventionism from that point of view in favor of the population than there is in the United States.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you. Very important points you have been making there. Mona, you also wanted to add on that one? And then probably also you can also then say your last words for today. Until then later, I will hand over to Jakob. And please, Mona.
Thank you, Stephanie. I love that last question, and in particular the word, the need for enlightened leadership. I think we're lacking that at the national level and at the international level. There is, I think, good news to be had in this very, very difficult situation that we find ourselves in. And while there is a lot of hate speech, while there is a lot of populist, one would even say fascistic tendencies emerging, those advocates of those hateful and fascistic tendencies have been exposed for their inability to lead, their inability to govern, not just as models for the world, but nationally. If you look around the world, the countries that are suffering the most, that have had the least effective and the least humane response to this crisis, are those that that speak to the lowest common denominator. Those societies that have aspired to the equality of their citizens, to the well-being of their citizens, to the sort of better angels, let's call them, of human society, have fared much better. Those who have a commitment to science, those who have a commitment to I don't want to call it a socially motivated, but a human motivated response have done much better. Take Germany versus UK, take South Korea versus the United States. So I mean, those that have the ability and the willingness to mobilize collectively, that do not look down at a collective response, that do not look down at a people-centered, in the true sense of people-centered response, are those that are faring well. And those models are now shifting. The appeal of those models is now shifting. So I think there is some enlightenment to be drawn from that. But we also need enlightened leadership at the international level. And what we have, I imagine that it would be necessary to relearn the lessons of World War II, the horrific lessons, the horrific sacrifices that were made to build this post-World War II architecture of law and order, of humanity, of human rights, should not have to be defended, should not have to be ideologically affirmed. Those lessons should not be so fleeting. But we find ourselves on the 75th anniversary of the UN, in fact, begging the world to come back to those values, to come back to those commitments, and come back to those aspirations, both in terms of avoiding war, but also about building a better world. So there is, I think, a recognition on the part of the larger membership. We see this in the efforts of the UN 75 declaration to recommit to the primacy of the Charter, to recommit to the multilateral approach to solving common threats and common challenges. And those that are advocating this return are very aware that the only way to solve these global crises is with a globally coordinated response. That does not prejudice the sovereignty of each individual nation. However, it's the very same instincts that drove the founding fathers of the Charter to conclude as a matter of self-interest that only together can we survive these threats. So we need to recommit to that understanding of the world's problems.
Thank you very much. Olaf, maybe do you want to add one last sentence until I hand over to Jakob? Or?
Well, of course, it's a bit, one should be cautious to make too early assessments about the management of the crisis. And I would be also not from a German perspective, I would still remain humble. We'll see how we manage the other aspects of the handling of the crisis. And there are, of course, exceptions. I mean, you have open and I would say science-based societies or communities like Sweden, which have had more problems. You have countries like some of the Central Eastern European states, or I would say Hungary even, which has so far, but important so far, not be doing that badly. But in general, I would say that there is no proof that authoritarian countries do better than democrats. I would say rather the other way round, rather. And I would also say that populist governments or strongly populist governments tend to fare worse. And this is, I think, so far, this is a clear tendency that we see, and that some of these claims which we have heard in March or April cannot be confirmed by the facts.
Thank you very much. For me, I will now hand over to Jakob Wöllenstein from the foundation. And for me, thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion. And I'm very sorry, Aliaksandr, that we didn't manage due to technical problems. But I encourage again, the paper is on the Minsk Dialogue homepage, and please check it out. Thank you very much. And Jakob will now give just a little bit sum up what has been said, and will give us a little bit on key elements what we can take from this discussion. So thank you from my side to all of you, and Jakob, please go along.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all of our panelists, to the two authors and the two high-ranking experts for commenting and being part of this discussion today. Summing this up in a few minutes is, as always, a big challenge, but I'm going to try to present you some key takeaways. So first of all, we had the analysis that we are still at the beginning of the crisis, or at least in the middle. So it's far from over, and this is going to stick with us. Tendencies, many of the panelists agreed, have been revealed or accelerated. Olaf said this, and for example, Mona said myths have been shaken. The West seems to be far from done, especially regarding that some initiatives have come out of the global West, and the balance of hard power has not shifted completely. So the overall message is multilateralism and globalism do matter. We looked at some actual problems that the UN has been facing. Mona said the failure of the Security Council was not surprising, but the degree of the failure was, although Aliaksandr pointed out in the few sentences that we got from him in the paper, that the UN was not in a good shape when the pandemic began. So it was not a failure during the pandemic so much as the structural difficulties that it found itself in. And so the watered down efficiency, for example, on the Security Council to come up with a statement is just rather a symptom of this more than the actual reason. So the question that we also discussed is, can the UN, or to what extent can the UN as an organization be blamed for this? The UN and its sub-organizations do not have the executive powers and mandates to battle pandemics or to go into countries without having to cooperate with them. So some of the criticism that the UN has been receiving rather goes to the very nature of the organization, that it doesn't have this mandate. The organization depends extremely dependent on member states and the willingness to give resources and, as I said, mandates. And Olaf pointed out that multilateral organizations are being abused as punching ball very often in the UN. More often maybe even than other organizations, is a target of this punching. So is the UN a failure? Angela pointed out that much of soul searching has been done in the 90s after some concrete failures on peacekeeping initiatives, and she hopes for this to be soul searching to be conducted also after COVID. But many problems don't come from the structure of the UN, but rather from the political situation of member states and their personal or individual quarrels, which is not something for the UN as an institution to fix. The Security Council being paralyzed and the WHO being left exposed to Chinese pressure and US attack, Mona pointed this out, is just a symptom of this. And also what Mona pointed out, that the permanent members of the Security Council don't always, even though they now campaign for multilateralism, are not always credible leaders themselves regarding situations at home. Also, we had this item of comparing the UN to institutions like the G20 or G7, which have not been producing much better results despite being small and more easily handleable. Olaf pointed out that big statements are being produced also by the European Council, but with a lack of a secretariat, structures that can follow up on initiatives and institutionally produce results. G20 and G7 are much weaker in the structure than the UN. So the EU has been doing better than these two formats, but still a lot will depend on vaccine. So benefits actually of the UN, we talked about this, is that first of all, multilateral organizations as such do matter. We've seen this, that it is necessary to coordinate the approaches. We had examples of, in Olaf's presentation, of WHO and WTO, so transparency, revealing hidden protectionism, pooling of resources, operational aid, and advising in countries have been very beneficial. And Angela pointed out that looking on the things that happen on the ground, which are often being forgotten, also do matter despite not being something which gloriously goes into big messaging. For example, in Belarus, that medical equipment and also funding for this has been provided. Also something which goes unappreciated very often happens in the personal sacrifice of personnel in peacekeeping missions, or also especially of non-military personnel, where people are exposed to psychological pressure and fatigue, being stuck at places somewhere distant from infrastructure or even health systems, which 50,000 civilian staff of the UN provides worldwide. We spent some time talking about peacekeeping operations. I don't want to reiterate all those details, but the result was that the criticism is also being overstated, that they do work on their missions, and some of the shutting down or looking inwards and protecting themselves on the ground was also connected to the necessity of them not to be spilling on the pandemic, by being able to maintain their capacity of being an actor on the ground. So that is, they managed fairly well. This, I think, was Mona's conclusion. So solutions to the questions. There was a little bit of an argument from what Aliaksandr wrote, and then Angela commented. Can the Security Council be enlarged, for example, to include more countries to make this body more responsible? There was some disagreement from Angela and also Olaf, saying that countries joining these bodies might rather learn how to talk to make it sound nice rather than actually changing their positions. One item that was mentioned by Mona was that the US-UK aggression in Iraq might have been the starting point when the United Nations credibility started to crumble, and that this needs to be fixed and addressed, but that the actual capacity of solving issues of the UN on big questions is under a question mark. Regarding climate change, having 50 years of attempts to talk about this, and on the pandemic, this is the same question. As long as people are even questioning and challenging scientific facts, how do we move on with this? So the ability of coming together around these big challenges like the pandemic and global warming and climate change, there's a question mark to this. But does it mean, to come back to the starting point, is it at the end of globalism? I think Olaf made a very strong point, saying and pointing out by concrete evidence that it is not the case, since supply chains for food and medical equipment are global in their nature. And in order to solve this issue, a pandemic that spreads worldwide, we need to cooperate maybe more precisely on certain issues, but learning lessons for which capacities we want global institutions like the UN to have. This is a lesson which we are learning. Still, actors do matter. Angela pointed to the United States elections this year in order to see what global leadership role the US can assume, and therefore also influence on the UN. This depends on individual actors' willingness. Final point, there's some good news. Mona pointed this out, that populists and their non-science-based approaches and irrational populism have been exposed globally, since countries that are science-based and human-centered have been faring better. Olaf agrees with this and says still the handling of the crisis is not over. Just shutting down is one step, but now coping with the consequences of the economic effect of this is the second step. So the crisis is not over and the handling is not over. But today's session is over. Unlike our series, which is set to continue. Next week, we are going to look at another international institution, not a global one, but at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Very different from today, but also an institution that aspires to have some hard power. I'm looking very much forward to this, also because I simply don't know so much about this myself. So all of you are very much invited to, first of all, again, and finally, read the papers of today. If you haven't read them yet, you can find them both on Minsk Dialogue and on KAS website. It's absolutely worth, it doesn't take too long, but also gives a summary of a lot of things that we discussed today. It is only left for me now to thank you all again. First of all, our panelists for being with us, Mona and Angela. Thank you very much. That was very helpful and eye-opening to learn from your insights on the UN. Thank you again to our two authors, Olaf and Aliaksandr. And thank you to our two cooperation partners, as always, the Minsk Dialogue and the International Institute for Peace. Sorry to the interpreter, I talk extremely fast, especially over these last minutes. I'm sure that was not possible to translate all of this. But for this, find the recording on our websites. Thank you. Be healthy, take care of yourself, and see you here next week. Goodbye.